What are the similarities between America and Egypt, and why is that important to the black experience? That's what we're talking about in this episode, so let's get to it. Hey, y'all, welcome back to another episode of Black with Power. I'm your host, Father Jabril Valentine, and this is the show for those who are inclined to emancipate themselves from mental slavery so that they can lead the movement of Jah people out of Babylon and into the promised land. Thank you for joining me. So you'll hear me talk a lot as we talk about, I said we reframing, right, and getting down to some basics of, what we need to understand in order to embrace power effectively, right? So back to some foundational understandings, right? You'll hear me talk a lot about Egypt, because this whole narrative of black power, this whole narrative of black redemption and how it leads to racial reconciliation is built upon the narrative of Joseph, the son of Jacob. In that, Joseph was in Egypt, right? And if we follow that narrative, as we'll talk about in other experiences, as I've talked about on other shows, putting blacks in their place is one of those shows. You can see it in the card. I think it's this way. In the card, you click on that, or in the link in the description, and find that show. But when we talk about America as Egypt, right? I mean, simply stated, is the land of our oppression. So you follow that narrative of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was sold into Egypt, into slavery by his brothers, right? A lot of the times we talk about in American civil religion, right? We talk about America being the New Jerusalem, the city on a hill, right? And where that comes from essentially is from white theology, right? Where they are claiming that Exodus narrative, that they left Europe and came to America to be free, right? The only problem with that is that they did not exodus from Europe because they were in bondage. I mean, they were still part of Europe. When the Israelites exodus from Egypt and they went into the wilderness, into the promised land, it wasn't like they were colonists who were loyal to Pharaoh, right? But when Europeans left Europe and came to America, they were colonists. They were agents of the crown. They at first represented the crown. It wasn't until they had clashes and disputes over who would control the money and the resources that they decided to break free from the crown. So, I mean, their analogy on America being the New Jerusalem doesn't quite fit, right? Nevertheless, that's what we're talking about. That's what they're talking about, right? So what I want us to understand is that just like Egypt, if we're following this biblical narrative and Judeo-Christian principles, just like Egypt was the land of oppression for the Israelites, and we go back before specifically to Joseph, Egypt was the land of oppression for Joseph. He was sold into slavery in Egypt, right? If we follow that, how Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt, and he was oppressed in Egypt, and then he rose to positions of prominence and had stature and whatnot. And I want to offer, which is the argument of Black Power, my new book, that the black experience in America is similar in the sense that black people were sold into slavery in America by their brothers and sisters, and served at the bottom of American life and have risen to positions of stature and power in some respects in the land of their oppression. Can we agree that the analogy holds? Like, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. We were sold into slavery by our brothers and sisters. That analogy holds, that Joseph was in bondage and at the bottom of the barrel in Egypt, and we have been, continue to be in many respects at the bottom of the barrel in America. That analogy holds, that Joseph rose to positions of prominence in the land of his oppression. And as we've seen with CEOs and the black elite, even President Obama, that blacks in America have risen to positions of stature in the land of their oppression. Can we agree that analogy holds? If we agree that analogy holds, then what we're talking about is that America is Egypt, right? So when we look at the biblical narratives and we talk about Egypt, we should also talk about America. And so that serves as the foundation for why I believe and how I follow the narrative of Joseph's rise to power and our rise to power, and why the Lord allowed Joseph to rise to power. As he said, God sent me ahead of you in order to save the lives of many, right? And therefore, in the same fashion, God allowed for black people to go into bondage in order to ultimately come full circle and be in a position to save the lives of many, right? Which in my view, gives purpose to the black experience, why God would allow us to experience everything that we've experienced. And the importance of that shift in model is because a lot of times when people, not we, right? When people, period, are trying to overcome oppression, even if it's personal oppression, right? Like, how many times you think about parenting as for instance, how many times people come out of abusive households and they can't wait for the opportunity for them to be abusive. You take it over to, fraternities. You see my fraternity brick, my wife's sorority brick, but you take it to fraternities, and whatever process you may have gone through, we know there are stories and chapters all around the country where, because of what was done to me, I can't wait till I'm in the position to do worse to somebody else or to do it to somebody else. And this idea of taking power because you're oppressed, and taking power, and now I become the possessor of power in order to oppress others, right? And there's this danger, right? And part of the insight, the gleaning of identifying America as Egypt, and really emphasizing the point that in this biblical narrative, America is Egypt. What we also understand, as someone who loves Egypt, we also understand that we as African people are not immune to the dangers of supremacy, right? And so the goal in Black Power is not to take one supremacist model and replace it with another supremacist model, right? The goal with Black Power is to destroy supremacy, right? And bring a new system that understands that we were created to be one, and that leads us into that model where we can be one as the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are one, right? So we have to understand that as we look to take power and take control and assert ourselves in the God-given role that we have been given as people in the likeness of Joseph, that have been put in a position, that have been put in a situation and allowed to have certain experiences in order to be brought to a time such as this and be brought to a place where we can lead the country out of its famine, out of its degradation. We also have to understand that we are not seeking the power for power's sake in order to become exerters and exactors of power and oppression on others, right? This is not about getting back, about revenge. It's about creating a better world, right? It's about building beloved community, right? It is about saving the lives of many from the destruction that is wrought by white supremacy. What I want you to understand, brothers and sisters, is that everything that we talk about, right? Everything that you hear in the subsequent episodes of the show, from now ad infinitum, even when we bring in interviews and whatnot, We will be talking from the framework of understanding that America is akin to Egypt, that the same thing that brought Egypt to destruction, its oppressive ways, its oppressive nature, is the same thing that is bringing America to destruction. Its oppressive ways, its oppressive nature. And if we are to have any hope of saving the country from destruction, it would be because we as a people, specifically black people, have come to understand that dynamic and end the destruction for the sake of everyone, not just for ourselves. So, you know, I want to know, what do you think of that idea that identifying America with Egypt in the context of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, and you and I, blacks who are, black Americans who are the descendants of those who were enslaved, being sold into slavery by our brothers and sisters in Africa? What do you think of that analogy, and how does that analogy begin to start reshaping your perspective? I want to hear from you. Please leave a comment, post a message, let me know what you think. Because a charge to keep we have, brothers and sisters: a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save and fit it for the sky. Yes, brothers and sisters, we have come a long way, but recently we have taken our eyes off the prize. So we are not there yet. So let us march on till victory is won. Live with power.